Welcome to our afternoon sessions on the present of philosophy of science. One of the things that we wanted to do as a part of this day was make sure we highlighted some of those infrastructural components that were mentioned in the history yesterday. In particular, have a roundtable conversation with current society presidents and journal editors. So that's what we have to begin our afternoon, and we'll follow that with two short flash talks that are contributed papers before we have the break. So I'm delighted to introduce our speakers. Two of them are in the room, two of them are online. So joining us online, Michela Massimi, currently the president of the Philosophy of Science Association, and Wendy Parker, co-editor-in-chief at the British Journal for the Philosophy of Science. And then in the room with us, Stéphanie Ruphy, president of the European Philosophy of Science Association, and James Weatherall, editor-in-chief at Philosophy of Science. And so obviously the kinds of questions that might come to the presidents as opposed to the journal editors would be slightly different. So we're going to structure this with a couple questions from me to kind of open us up. And then when we move to the general discussion, people obviously can ask targeted questions. And let me just say, for the journal editor's benefit, no complaining about referees and the process. That's not what this session is all about. The goal is to really assess the way in which the journals and the societies are a part of the living profession and where things stand today. So let me start with some questions for our presidents of the associations, and I'm going to go to those who are online first. So Michela, I will ask you to start with this question. How do you see the current state of philosophy of science as a profession from the vantage point as president of one of its major societies?
Thank you very much, Alan, and thank you all the organizer for having me. I'm very sorry that I cannot be there with you all because it is an amazing conference. So thank you for accommodating me online. I'm sure, the colleagues in the panel can comment as well as myself to the question about the current state of the profession, and if your conference is anything to go by. I think it's a thriving state. I think we've seen the field really growing remarkably over the past 2 decades. Since I have memories of myself entering the field maybe a few years earlier than Anna Alexandrova. I really enjoyed listening to Anna's personal kind of biographical take on her early days as a graduate student at the LSE. The field has changed remarkably. It's much larger. We have big programs, graduate programs that are producing excellent quality graduate students and postdoc. And I think we see that reflected in really the diversity of topics and areas and fields in the philosophy of science that were not really there 20, 30 years ago when myself, like Anna and many others in the room were there, started as graduate students. I think this is evident also in the Philosophy of Science Association, in the biennial meetings, if you look at the programs and how that program have gradually changed and evolved over the past decade or so in becoming more inclusive and diverse in the kind of trend that we see. I think philosophy of science is a very responsive field that is really very sensitive to these dynamic changes in the sciences, and we've seen that with the growth of area from philosophy of climate science. We have Wendy here, philosophy of machine learning. We had loads of submission this year for the PSA biennial meeting in New Orleans coming up in November in the area of machine learning and AI. Philosophy of neuroscience, philosophy of social sciences, and many, many more. So I think this is an important junction for the field as such and for our profession to really make a difference in public narrative and I think for society at large. So that's my take, and now I can't see anyone else, so I'm kind of black screen, I suppose.
I'm sure there will be. I'm sure there will be questions, but Stéphanie?
Oh, hello. Hello, everybody, and thank you very much, Alan, for the invitation. So from the EFSA point of view, it's a bit tricky, of course, to give you a global description of what's going on in the profession in Europe, because as we all know, there are big differences, big variation from one country to another. All the more because EFSA membership extends beyond countries which belong to the European Union, including, for instance, people like a country like Ukraine, where you can imagine the material condition and the academic life is a bit different from what's going on in Germany or France. So that being said, let me focus on what I think is a common situation, not in all countries in Europe, of course, but in some countries. And I will describe this, and also what can EFSA do about it. And I will describe this situation as a kind of situation in some countries where you have a kind of two-speed situation. What do I mean by that? I mean that what we perceive from EFSA is that in some countries in Europe, one subset only of the profession is being part of this international community, mostly because people have been trained abroad, they work in English, and they share our interest as regards topics and subject and all that. But this is essentially the subset of the profession that EFSA captures, actually. So it's not the whole profession that are member of EFSA. There are, in some countries at least, there are many people who do not work in English or do not publish in English, but more interestingly, there are people who have very different kind of interactions with for instance, social sciences or other branches of philosophy, not to mention continental philosophy. And so the easy way out would be to say, okay, these are not the good philosophers, they need a better friend and mentors and all that. But that's not the way we consider the situation from the point of view of EFSA. And the challenge now for us, EFSA, which is now a well-established society with a very good journal, EGPS, and visible from the rest of the world, the challenge is really to try to reach out to the other subsets of the profession in some countries. And why do we try to do that in EFSA? It could be, of course, for like political reason, because we want, in Europe, we still need more than ever, more integration, more circulation, more unity. Well, depending, of course, on your political position, but let's put it that way. But it's also for epistemic reason, because we don't want to miss out what's going on there, because it might be, in some cases, in many cases, it's interesting work. So I'm just going to advertise one recent initiative we had at EFSA, and I want to thank Bobby Voss. I think Bobby Voss is not in the room, but I think he's attending the conference, is behind this initiative, is that we have a new seminar. The title is Epistemic Diversity in European Philosophy of Science. And the point is to hear more about other traditions, but not only like historical traditions, but interesting work going on, and to share more broadly those things. And a way also to increase this integration of other subsets of the profession is to interact more with national societies, because national societies in Europe are exactly the location where you can have this more interaction between this subset of the profession, which is integrated internationally, and the rest of the profession. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Great. So let's transition then and get some perspective from the journal editors. So, Wendy, we'll start with you. How do you see the current state of scholarship in philosophy of science from your vantage point as an editor of one of its premier journals?
Well, thanks very much for including me in the meeting. I'm really happy to be here. I would say that the state of scholarship is very healthy. And I think a lot of what I'm going to say is going to echo a lot of what Michela said in terms of the growth of the field. So we have an almost overwhelming number of submissions every year now, more than 500 in a typical year. But it's a really nice mix of general philosophy of science and philosophical issues in specific sciences, and over time just broadening to include topics that we didn't see say 5 or 8 years ago. So things like digital philosophy of science, or more work in the geosciences, a lot of work in machine learning. I do feel that the social sciences are still underrepresented. I feel like we don't get as many submissions as I would like in the social sciences. But really growth and expansion, and we really try to keep an open mind when we get a paper that doesn't fit into any of the other topics that we've seen before. One thing that I wanted to mention, which I think is really interesting, is that at least at BJPS, we've seen a really steady increase in multi-authored papers. So if you go back to 2011, as far as I can tell, we had about 10% of our submissions being co-authored or multi-authored, and now it's over 20%, and it's a very steady, robust kind of trend. And these papers tend to be more successful too, so they end up, being accepted at a higher rate than the background rate. So I think that's a really interesting trend, which echoes also some of the themes we heard this morning about collaboration and how the field might be evolving, whether that's collaboration with scientists or with other philosophers.
Great.
Thanks.
Okay, Jim.
Yeah, sure. I feel like there's not a lot that I can say that's not going to repeat things that have already been said. But let me try to give some concrete numbers. So one thing that has really struck me is just how strong the early career researchers in philosophy of science are. And so this is something I just have at my fingertips because we recently gave data to the PSA Awards Committee of papers that are eligible for the Nagel Award. And so this is a prize that's given to papers that are published in philosophy of science by early career researchers. You have to have either been a graduate student or within 5 years of your PhD when the article was submitted in order to be eligible. And so for last year, right, so 2023, that volume, 51 regular issue papers were published in philosophy of science. 28 of them were eligible for the Nagel Award. So 55% of the papers that we published were submitted by people who were within 5 years of their PhD, which I think is just, an incredible sign of the strength of the junior people in the field. I think we've also seen the broadening of the field. I've been involved in philosophy of science in different capacities for over 15 years. I was managing editor when I was a graduate student, and I was associate editor for many years, and then I became editor-in-chief. And when I was managing editor, we had 4 associate editors. Now we have more than I'm able to count. It's 9, I think, give or take. Partly it's volume that has driven that, but more than volume, it has breadth that has driven that. It's no longer the case that we can manage the submissions that we get with a philosopher of physics, a philosopher of biology, a general philosopher of science, and someone who can do sort of formal stuff in decision theory and formal epistemology. We need a much broader range, right? We need someone who can handle philosophy of AI. We need someone who can handle, philosophy of cognitive science. We need people who can handle philosophy of social science, philosophy of psychology, philosophy of medicine. We're getting a much broader range of submissions. And the same thing happened with our editorial board. When I came on, I doubled the size of the editorial board. And there were a number of reasons to do that, but one of the key ones was that we rely on the editorial board for expert advice on difficult decisions. And increasingly, it was the case that our difficult decisions were the ones that were falling between the cracks of our associate editors, because even with as many associate editors as we now have, we didn't have perfect coverage of the field. And so the people that we added were almost all in areas that we simply didn't have coverage in previously on the editorial board. And so the whole structure of the journal is different now, reflecting the way in which the field has changed. The last thing I want to say is, because we've been spending a lot of time in the last 2 days reflecting on institutions, I want to sort of reflect a little bit on the fact that these institutions are heavily interconnected, dependent on one another in perhaps surprising ways. So the PSA is primarily funded by philosophy of science. So the journal generates revenue through subscriptions. The Cambridge University Press gives a portion of that money goes to the PSA from Cambridge University Press. But as many of you know, academic publishing is in a period of transition. There's a lot of very active debate happening right now about the role of open access, how much it should cost to publish open access, whether subscription fees are sustainable. But an institution like the PSA depends on how those other kinds of conversations that can feel quite distant from the institutions that structure the community turn out. And I think people have many reasonable opinions. I think people have seen different models of open access succeed and fail in different contexts. But I think from a historian, thinking about the historians of the future, looking back on this period, I think that one of the things that is going to turn out to have been most important is how shifts in academic publishing change funding models for the other institutions in our discipline.
Great. So let's turn back to our presidents and ask them to move out of the present and look out into the future. What developments in philosophy of science will characterize the profession over the next decade? That's a maybe request for prognostication, but maybe also what would you most like to see happen over that same period, which doesn't necessarily have to be the same as what you think might happen. Michela?
Sure, thanks. Unless Stephanie wants to go first on this one. Would you like to go first, Stephanie? I'm happy to, but
It's really up to you, Michela. So,
Whatever
Okay.
you prefer.
well,
yeah, well, obviously, as you very correctly put it, Alan, I mean, we are at the level of making sort of, predictions about what the future might hold. But I think one thing that we have seen, and we have all already commented on, is this increase in specialization in our field. The field has become very broad, very diverse, and with lots of different trend and subfield and affiliated societies and network that certainly didn't exist even 20 years ago. And I think that has been a very healthy, positive development. So we don't have just the Philosophy of Science Association and the EPSA, but we have a plurality of subfield and other organizations that obviously have been blossoming over these decades. So it's clear to me that that trend will continue. So what goes under the name of philosophy of science in practice has been, I think, one of those important developments over the past decades. And by philosophy of science in practice, I don't just mean the SPSP network, but really a broad trend of engaging with scientific practice and not just with a kind of syntactic, semantic approach to scientific theories, which we had in the past. So society like Integrated Eastern Philosophy of Science, to which I belong, but also OPOS and other societies like the INEM for economics and the social sciences, STS, we have heard Carol Lee on the social engaged philosophy of science. Those are all part of this trend that I would call the philosophy of science in practice. So even in my field, Eastern philosophy of physics, it has been evident, that trend. So when I started as a graduate student, really the kind of areas that we were all working on were primarily philosophy of space-time or philosophy of quantum mechanics. And in the past decade or so, we have seen philosophy of particle physics, philosophy of cosmology, philosophy of statistical mechanics. So there's been an absolute explosion of subfield even within well-established fields. So that's definitely a trend that I would imagine is going to stay with us and will continue. There's been a very healthy, positive trend for our profession in general. In terms of what I would like mostly to see, I mean, I'm happy for people to pursue whatever their passion is. And I think it's no matter whether that is in general philosophy of science, which is also a lot of what I do, or a more specialized topics. One particular trend that I'm very interested in, and I think is more recent, but is probably bound to develop further, is what I would call political philosophy of science. And it's really an offspring of part of the literature on feminism, but also the literature on science and value. I wouldn't cluster it quite as science and value. I would cluster it as political philosophy of science, because there are questions about justice, injustice in democratic society, or philosophy of race. Now the PSA has a philosophy of science, philosophy of race prize, among other. That has definitely been, I think, a new trend, together with what normally goes under the umbrella of transdisciplinary philosophy of science, as a philosophy of science that engages with local communities, or co-development, co-creation of knowledge with communities that traditionally have not been part of the canon. And again, there have been talks this morning by Janet and others that have been spotlighting that tradition. So I think that trend will continue to grow. I think it's a very positive trend. It's very timely and relevant for our society, really, to reflect on the role of science and scientific knowledge in democratic society, and the benefits and also harmful uses of science and technology for our societies. So that's my 2 penny on predicting on the future. And I don't know how reliable I am anyway, but on Stéphanie, there has been never.
Stephanie?
Okay, so just a few remarks. Maybe first, it seems that in some countries in Europe, there's a trend toward funding of PhD students through research projects, like 3, 4, or 5 year research projects. That means that more and more PhD students don't choose their topic. Is it a good thing or a bad thing in the long term? Maybe first you can say, okay, maybe there will be more relevant topics, or I don't know, let's give it, but I think it's an important trend for us to think about. And I know that in certain countries in Europe, there's almost no possibility to have a fellowship without being associated with a research project, meaning a very limited choice of research topics. So that's my first remark. Second remark, it goes with it that more and more PhD students write their dissertation in English, but that can be a bit tricky, because in some countries, for instance, I have in mind the example of Croatia, the national laws expect you to write a minimum amount of work in the national language. And so that seems to be in tension with the internationalization and all that, but of course the motivation behind that is the worry, the concern to keep the language is lively as scientific language. So it's a bit tricky to navigate between these expectations, like in internationalization and write in your own language. Another brief remark, it seems that there is a growing demand, not only for teaching, but also research and interaction with scientists about research integrity. And I'm not mentioning ethics, but really specifically research integrity. And I think that philosophers of science are really well equipped, and the science and values literature, of course, comes to mind to play a bigger role in the shaping of the multiple recommendations flourishing in every country and at the European level about what are good practices in science and what are bad practices, and what scientific institutions should do when scientists do things wrong. And maybe a last remark, but that's related to what Michela said. It's I don't know in the States, but in some countries in Europe, you feel like young scientists are much more demanding as regard the meaning of what they do, the impact of their research on society and all that. And so it seems that there is also a growing demand to teach more about responsibility and social impact of research, of scientific research.
Okay, so I'm going to turn to the journal editors and give them a similar sort of question. So Wendy, Jim, what developments in philosophy of science publishing will be important to watch over the next decade, at least from what you can see from your current post? And What do you think will stay similar to the past, and what do you think might be very different going forward? So, Wendy, we can go to you first.
Thanks. I mean, I do think the shift toward open access is something to watch, and attending to how that's going to impact on society funding and so on in the way that Jim was alluding to. I also think it'll be interesting to watch whether more and more journals shift to online only publication and sort of the sort of print phases out. That's happening to some extent now, and it has some benefits and some losses. You can't hold the issue in your hand. And one of the things I also think is something to watch, and maybe will undergo some change. I'm not going to wager a prediction on this one, but is the peer review process. I mean, one of the side effects of the growth in the field that everyone has been describing is that there's just a lot of papers and a lot of peer reviewing that needs to be done. And it's hard to find peer reviewers a lot of the time. And I think we maybe need a better system for identifying a broader range of peer reviewers, finding people who are appropriate to review. But I think that there's an interesting question about whether, we should have a conversation about the very model of peer review and whether we stick to, getting at least 2 reviewers or whether we opt for something more streamlined. Some people have proposed post-publication peer review. So I think it will be interesting to see how this gets managed over time, just because I do think that the workload and the demands in terms of peer review is really, it's getting to be a lot. So yeah, I'm going to leave it at that. I don't know what'll be similar. I'll let Jim tackle that one.
Yeah. So I think that we face some very deep questions about what the point of academic journals are. The point is of academic journals. Because increasingly, the costs of publishing a journal are not going to be material costs, right? It's not the costs of printing and shipping the journal. It's the cost of getting, to some extent, typesetting, but even that isn't, presumably isn't going to be a long-term cost as sort of do-it-yourself typesetting becomes ever better. And I think many people already feel as if journal production is, not at our journal, of course, but at other journals, journal production is actively interfering with their ability to effectively communicate their ideas, that they would much rather that people just compile the LaTeX that they gave them, rather than create an XML file and put 1 million new errors in. And so the costs are largely human costs, and human costs within our own field, right? It's the cost of supporting editors and peer reviewers. At least at our journal, none of the editors are compensated, none of the peer reviewers are compensated. And so it's sort of a community-borne cost. And so thinking about the relationship between what those costs are and what the benefits of publishing things in journals as opposed to simply putting them on archives, announcing them on your website, putting them on Twitter, and so on. Now, I want to be very clear. I think that there are benefits to academic publishing, right? I mean, I'm spending a lot of my time contributing to academic publishing. I think that is an important thing to do. I think, though, that we don't have as much clarity as a community, given the changing technological landscape, as we ought to, about what the point is and how to structure publishing in a way that reflects what our actual goals are for the journals that we're putting out. Okay, so I mean that's sort of a long ramble without a point. I'm sort of inviting you to reflect on what our goals are, and part of what I'm thinking about is the way in which philosophy of science, debates around philosophy of science, have changed over the last 15 years. And so, a former society president, former colleague of Alan's here in Minnesota, Ken Waters felt very strongly some years ago that philosophy of science should be online, open access, and have published much, much more than it does. And there was a big debate around whether or not that was the right way to go. And there was an argument on one side that journals, at least at that point, I think they still do, play an important role in academic promotion and tenure, that there's a kind of signaling that happened when the community, through anonymous peer review and editorial judgments and so on, select some articles for a journal and other articles not. And so that's one role that journals play, and that is the sort of thing that might bear on how we structure these things going forward. But it's important for us to recognize that that is one of the things that maybe the thing that we're concerned about, and balance that against things like access, right? So one issue about open access publication is that it's often very costly for people who don't have a lot of institutional support to publish in journals that are only open access, and also weigh against the idea that reviewers make a lot of mistakes, editors make a lot of mistakes, a lot of great work doesn't get published in the top venues. Maybe we need to rethink how we're doing that. And so I think I finished.
So Jim has already sort of signaled that he's inviting questions. So I'm imagining some of you are starting to formulate them. Before we turn to opening things up for kind of general questions to our panel, I want to give them one last opportunity to tackle two things. I'd like them each, so this is both for the society presidents and for the journal editors, share one major opportunity and one major threat to philosophy of science in the future. Whether that be in the next few years or something that you think might be farther out, major opportunity or a major threat for philosophy of science in the future, maybe in the next few years, maybe farther out. This time I won't immediately go to Michela. I will invite whoever would like to sort of jump in to start us off. Does anybody want to go there first?
Well, I can start.
All right, Stephanie's in.
Okay, so for opportunity, I start with that. Open access is certainly a big opportunity from the point of view of EPSA, European Philosophy of Science, because it, of course, eases diffusion, and the goal is to end up with a publishing system where you don't have to pay to be published in open access, which is not the case. And it's very important for us as a society because not all our members can afford publishing going open access. And so there's a dissymmetry of diffusion of your results, which is really worrying. So it's really a big topic, open access in Europe, with many laws and regulations, depending on the country. For instance, in France, you are now expected to go open access. If you don't, your evaluation is impacted by that. So there is a very it didn't come from the scientific communities. It's more also a political initiative for many reasons. And so globally, I will also mention artificial intelligence in relation to these issues of languages and diffusion, because tools of artificial intelligence might help mitigate uneven access to resources in English and diffusion in English. I have another one, and I have no trade, so I can have to other opportunity. I think in Europe, there's a growing awareness of the benefits of language and epistemic diversity. And we have now the Barcelona principles and other principles that really aim at easing the fact that you can work in your own language and that will not negatively impact the diffusion of your results. Last one. We can expect, this has been discussed this morning already, we can expect an evolution of the evaluation criteria. In Europe now we have this, what is called COARA, it's the coalition for advancing research assessment, and that also relates to the role of publication. And that was said this morning, this is the idea, and it's very concrete for academics in some countries already. You're not going to be judged only on your publication, but also on other items on your CV. And this is just not to say nice things. This is concretely implemented, for instance, in some countries already. And that will hopefully, this evolution of the evaluation criteria will hopefully help us to reduce this gap that was also mentioned this morning between our concern to be more socially relevant, but the fact that the kind of work we value, the kind of mainly publications in good journals, is clearly in tension with this objective of being more socially relevant and reach out to other people outside the academic world. But if we don't overcome this tension as regards evaluation, because this is the main thing, evaluation and funding, if we come into if we overcome this tension, maybe we can be both socially relevant and happier, the way we produce things.
Great, thanks. Who would like to go next? Wendy, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the thought I had follows well from Stephanie's, and I want to name the same thing as both the opportunity and the challenge, and that's possibility of non-academic career tracks for people. I mean, I think the more that the field becomes outward-looking, as it is, and engaging with like contemporary problems, engaging with scientific teams, we start to see opportunities for people to pursue careers that are not just, traditional posts in philosophy departments or something like that. And I think that's a great opportunity, and I think we don't do enough now to help people look early on at those possibilities and what they might be like. But that's also the challenge, is how to do that alongside training people who do want to have academic jobs. So I feel that there's an untapped opportunity for philosophers to become really embedded in more communities and in different kinds of career roles than they currently are.
Okay. Jim, go ahead.
Yeah, so I want to, I think, give what I see as the sort of the risk or the challenge associated with that optimistic vision. So one thing that I think has happened in the last 20 years is that we've seen massive growth in professional philosophy of science. Our professional societies have grown. We have lots of people publishing in philosophy of science, talking about many different areas of science in our journals. There's a risk, though, which is that to the extent that philosophy of science becomes sort of an autonomous discipline, separate both from the sciences and from philosophy, it becomes less important for us professionally to speak outside of professional philosophy of science. And so while it can feel internally as if we're talking about so many more things, if we aren't in situations where other people are listening and we're having an impact on the fields that we're talking about, it becomes rich feeling from the inside but kind of irrelevant from the outside. And I think that's something we need to be attentive to as we grow, is that we're growing in ways that aren't just outward looking, but outward reaching and making contact with the rest of the world that we're interested in engaging with.
Okay, Michela.
Yes, well, I echo very much what has been said so far. So I see a major opportunity really in the visibility that our profession has gained over the past few decades. Now we have philosophers of science advising governments on AI strategy. We have philosophers of science co-authoring IPCC reports, advising environmental agency and public health board. I think this is something that we should be immensely proud of. It's something that I think many other areas of philosophy cannot say the same about themselves. So I think this will provide more and more opportunities for the next generations of graduate students to really, as Wendy was saying, considering also career paths outside the normal kind of career as an academic. At the same time, what I see as a threat is precisely, I think, this kind of liminal role of our field, somewhere straddling between the humanities on one end and the sciences at the other end. It's a double-edged sword. And it's a double-edged sword because on one end, it gives us, I think, an advantage compared to many other areas of the humanities and in philosophy, the ability to kind of go native and speak the language of science and really do philosophy of science that is relevant to public policy and decision-making. At the same time, institutionally, if we look at the institutional scaffold in which we are embedded, what makes that problematic is that very often philosophy of science is seen with and I'm going to echo here really, Jim, with a sense of skepticism by many colleagues, not just in philosophy, but within the humanities. I think there was a question from the audience earlier today, I don't know, it was Alan Richardson that was also presenting the same problem, right? When it comes to reward and incentives, from promotion in academic career to grant application success and so forth, we need to constantly defend our relevance to the wider humanities. And very often we try to, apply for grants in, funding body that are more scientific, and we're told, well, no, you are part of the humanities anyway. So very often we tend to fall into the crack of this liminal role. So it's a blessing, but it's also, I think, a threat in the sense that we need to be aware of those institutional infrastructure that really, over time, and we've heard the stories also this morning, have made really difficult for philosophers of science to be appreciated, to be rewarded within their own institution, precisely because of the empirically engaged kind of philosophy of science in practice that gets done, and that very often is not recognized as valuable within an institutional system that rewards other kinds of parameters. So that remains, in my mind, one of the perennial threats that we face. But yeah, as I said, the plus side is that our professions become a lot more visible and present in society.
Okay, thank you to all. Now we will transition to an opportunity for folks to ask questions. I anticipate there will be quite a few. Why don't we start there in the back?
Thank you so much for this discussion. My name is Rami. I'm a graduate student at the University of Cincinnati, and I'm also the assistant director to the PSA. So Michela is my boss's boss. Hi, Michela. I also, part of my duties is the archive assistant with the PhilSci archive. And looking at the state right now of publication, it seems that we're caught in between looking forward towards a time where open access is the norm that we have, and we're still having some sort of like behind closed door publication that's still going on. And it seems that the PhilSci archive is sort of the current mechanism, at least, that is trying to sort of democratize access to the work of philosophers of science that is being published. And one of the ways that we're trying to increase visibility of the archive is to reach out to journal editors to encourage them to add us to their acceptance email, to encourage authors to post their preprints on the archive to increase visibility and allow others the chance to engage with their work. This kind of approach has had its limitations. Sometimes when we approach editor, they tell us that they would love to include us. Some would find some resistance, either from the other editors or from sometimes the publishers themselves, who don't want that work to be put online for democratic and use. And we're sort of in this state where we're trying to find different ways to approach that problem. And I was wondering if you have certain insights about like what other approaches could we utilize to increase the visibility of the archive and make it sort of a more effective mechanism to sort of democratize access to philosopher of science work that is being done. Thank you.
I mean, I'm ex officio on the PhilSci archive board, and this came up at our the most recent board meeting, and I didn't have any ideas then either. So it's all a little bit foreign to me because I, began life as a physicist, where people have just been posting their work on the archive since, the 80s without, maybe not the 80s, but since the 90s, without like really thinking of. I mean, like that was just the normal thing to do. And so the idea when I got into philosophy that anyone who would resist putting their paper on the archive, I still encounter this even with my graduate students, where they're like, well, should I, shouldn't I? And I can point to concrete instances where my graduate students have ended up being, I would say, disadvantaged by the fact that they didn't put their thing on the archive, right? Because, it took them, 18 months to get their paper published. And in the meantime, someone else wrote the same paper, and they did put it on the archive. And, at that point, it's kind of awkward to be like, oh, well, but this was already accepted at some journal. And so I don't understand the mindset of editors who don't want to promote the PhilSci archive, which makes it hard for me to understand the what you have to do to those people to convince them to see the light.
Wendy, do you want to speak to that?
No, I don't have
Wendy?
anything. I don't have any ideas. I don't have any ideas either. We also encourage people to post on the archive. So, and I was sitting here racking my brain for some good ideas, but yeah, maybe it is a cultural thing. Like Jim was suggesting for the physics community, and maybe over time we'll get there, but not as quickly as we like. I don't know. Sorry.
I can say authors in the room resist. If journals tell you don't put your stuff on the archive, ignore them. I mean, what are they going to do to you? Like you can put on your CV, this was accepted as such and such journal, and then was unaccepted because I posted it on the archive. That's great for you. I don't think anyone's going, like any letter writers are going to be like, well, this was accepted, but then they broke the rules. Just put it on the archive. Get it out there.
So you have been told. Paul.
Thank you very much for the presentations. I'd like to get some more numbers. So what is the membership in both societies? What's the proportion of non-males? And what are the absolute numbers of submissions in the journals? And again, what's the proportion of non-males?
So let's start with the societies first.
Plus rejection rate, of course.
Societies first, and then the journal editors. So, Stéphanie, Michela?
This is where I would need Max. I would need our executive director to give me the numbers of membership. So I might be wrong, so don't put me on record on this. But I think the PSA ranges around 800, between 800 and 1,000 members. But membership membership subscriptions tend to fluctuate quite a bit, and I'm sure this is the same also with the EPSA, depending on whether we are in the kind of year of the biennial conference or not. So sometimes people send a membership subscription because they're planning to come to the conference, and maybe they forget to renew it the following year. So there's a bit of a kind of fluctuating trend. But roughly, those are the numbers that I have on top of my mind. Don't know whether Stéphanie has the numbers for the apps.
Yeah, if I remember.
And I don't have, sorry, I would say that I don't have the gender distribution data that you are describing, but actually we have a new chair for the PSA membership committee, Richard Kenny, that I know is planning with our committee precisely to field those data, because we haven't gathered those data in some time. So when we were with University of Chicago Press, at the moment of the membership subscription, people were asked to provide their data. So there was some sort of questionnaires, which actually I remember at the time when I was in the governing board back in 2012 with Roberta Milstein and Ellen Longino and Miriam Solomon, we decided that we needed to gather that kind of data. So Chicago did it for the PSA for many years. But because now we have left University of Chicago, we have moved to Cambridge, and we have decoupled effectively the membership from the subscription to the journal. So Cambridge University Press doesn't collect that data anymore for the PSA. It's done in-house. So that's why I need Max Cormendi, the executive director, because he will know what those numbers are. But as I said, it's part of the remit of the PSA membership committee led by Richard Kenny to do a survey very soon of membership to collect a variety of data, not just about gender, but also about geographic, institutional distribution, and many other characteristics. So that's coming, but I don't have the data, I'm afraid, with me today. Sorry, Stephanie, you were saying something.
If I remember correctly, for websites, the paying members are like 380, maybe a bit lower than 400, and it's a 2-year membership. It's a 2-year fee, so there's not so much fluctuation from one year to another because of that. As far as I know, but I think I know, we don't have any personal data regarding gender or because as you know, it's a bit tricky in Europe to get personal data because of the RGPD and all that. So we could do it, but that means setting up a system to collect personal data, explaining what you do with the data and all that. We would like to do that, but not yet.
We get about 400 submissions a year, and we publish about 12% of them, so around 50. We do collect demographic data. I don't know what we do with it. I mean, I was tempted. I thought it would be rude to take out my phone and look at our last annual report. We're preparing our one for this year now, but I could look at the one from last year. But I don't recall that we include that information. I think in principle we could, and we're prepared to if Michela tells us that that's what she wants. But I don't know it off the top of my head.
Okay, Wendy?
Well, the benefit of being online is that I can pull up the annual report. But actually, so can you. So we publish all of that information on the Auxiliary Hypotheses blog for BJPS. So you can get all that information broken down, including gender information, acceptance rates by different categories. But last year we had 571 submissions and the acceptance rate was 9.5%. And I'm not going to run through all the categories, but as I say, if you just go to the journal website and go to our blog, you can get a report for the year with all the kinds of information that you were requesting.
Okay. I will say one thing, which is, I mean, I already mentioned how that such a large fraction of the papers that we're publishing are by relatively junior people, right? And the numbers that I quoted were for single-authored papers. Many of our papers are co-authored, and co-authored papers also tend to skew more junior, but they aren't eligible for the Nagel Award. The field has much more gender diversity in its younger cohort than older cohorts. And that's, of course, reflected in the recent issues of the journal.
Okay, more questions. So I have one here. Yeah.
Thanks. So mainly for the journal editors, I'm curious about whether, given the rise of specialization in philosophy of science and sub-specialization, philosophy of quantum field theory, philosophy of ecology, and so on, to what extent can we have the journals retain the ambition that what is published there is supposed to be of interest to pretty much anybody interested in the philosophy of science, right? If I have a fairly technical paper in the philosophy of quantum field theory, it seems implausible to suggest that should be of interest to somebody working in sort of philosophy of biology or something like that. So, but yeah, so do we still want to retain that ambition as journals?
I didn't know that was our ambition. So I mean, the way I think of our goal is to publish the best work done in philosophy of science, and that has always meant sometimes publishing work that is technical and not going to be accessible to the entire community. On the other hand, I think it's extremely important that even very technical work have clear philosophical significance, and that be manifest in the work. And so there's always some trade-offs involved. But I don't see work being technical as a barrier to acceptance. Much more common is that the work is not doesn't make a clear philosophical argument on the basis of the technical work that's there. But if it does, then we have no problem publishing it.
Wendy?
Yeah, I have nothing to add. I agree with Jim.
Okay. Holly?
Thanks. So I kind of wanted to respond to that and kind of open for discussion because I don't think there's any good answer to this, but it's kind of worth putting out there. So, for example, for the 2022 PSA program, there was a lot of different transitional things that were happening, both with like the journal editor staff and the journal location, and with the executive director starting with one and then changing to another. And part of what came out during that is that there was a lot of different, there was no consistency in the way in which we were gathering demographic data. And even in the PhilSci archive, the list of tags that you could put on to label what your submission was different than the tags that you had in the system that we were using in Drifta at the time. And so there's a way in which there's difficulty in getting there to be consistency in tracking any of this stuff, because you can't tell how we're improving or not improving on any of these categories unless you're actually tracking it. At the same time, there wasn't any consistent way in which you can take this demographic data because it varied so much country by country and region by region, what would be sort of the relevant categories, especially for like racial categories we found in Canada and the United States were just really different. And so I was wondering if you could say something about this, because also when Stephanie's got a very good points. Already when you're taking this data, sometimes you've only completed like 2 or 3 different demographic categories, and when you have 300 or 400 people, you might now just be down to 3 people, and then you've now identified yourself. And so there's these real issues in trying to both constructively track things, but also reconciling these very different ways in which you're sort of taking variables. So I was wondering if you just had anything to say on that.
Yep, that's for anybody.
Yes.
I mean, maybe there's. So,
Maybe Carol can.
Janet, did you have a follow-up on that?
No.
Okay. So,
But I think Carol does.
yeah, let's follow up on this particular point.
Thanks. Is it the American Chemical Society? The big, they have coordinated with I think more than 20 societies that publish journals to try to create a standardized category system for demographic identity. And it's a very complicated problem, as you have noted. But we may be able to benefit from their work. They started at least a couple of years ago, and so there may be some outputs from their collaborative efforts that we can use. It still doesn't solve the problem of re-identification. I think to address this problem sometimes, as NIH does, collects demographic data and then sets it aside separately. But even then, if someone looking at the data may be able to re-identify somebody, sometimes people try to aggregate over years or across journals. So, for example, the Velocity of Science journal could combine forces with other journals to aggregate data and hope that maybe by doing so, re-identification is less likely. But it's tricky because we're small enough that that's an issue.
I will mention one other challenge. So one of the first things that I tried to do when I took over as editor was related to one of the issues that Holly mentioned, which is figure out how to standardize our submission categories. And so basically what we had was the things that occurred to the person who was editor when we first started on editorial manager back in 2008, supplemented by the things that had occurred to subsequent editors in between in the order in which they occurred to people. And that looked bad for a whole bunch of reasons, because you could sort of see what things felt like an afterthought and what things didn't, and you had some duplication and overlap, and some things were very broad and some things were very narrow. And so I don't know, Alan and Angela probably remember we had at our first associate editor meeting a discussion about how to handle this. And the suggestion was made that we talk to Zvi at the archive and try to at least make things uniform with the Phil Sci archive, and also coordinate with Max to see if we can get things coordinated with the PSA meetings. And eventually I just gave up. And the reason that I gave up was that within our system, if you remove something, it breaks all of the data for existing submissions. And so you can't just start from scratch. You can randomize the order in which things appear. That, it turns out, you can do. And you can add stuff, but you can't get rid of stuff that's already there. And so you have to sort of work around the way things have happened historically. I suspect that similar issues would arise with demographic data, where we could ask new questions, but it would be challenging to have continuity. And even if we just removed the section that we have and put a new just ask totally new questions, then we don't get to look at trends that go before, because it's not clear how to compare data when the questions are asked in different ways, right? None of which is to say that following the ACS wouldn't be the best way forward, but even that introduces challenges, and there are trade-offs.
Okay, so I've got a couple people in the queue, and I'm not sure we're going to have enough time. So I'm just going to see as quick as you can when you ask your question. Stay succinct, and we'll see if we can get through them. Next one is Marshall.
Yeah, I think this is really quick. This is for Wendy and Jim, especially. When you were talking about advocating preprints, preprints at what point? So one of the things that's different between sciences and philosophy is that we don't have labs, so the lab is the paper. In many cases, we're thinking in the words. And so, I think there's a difference between preprints just right before publication, right after acceptance versus earlier drafts. And just clarification.
Wendy, do you want to say something about this?
Sure. I mean, this is just my personal view, but I mean, I would think that you want to post things when you think it's something that is polished enough that you would be ready for it to be shared. I mean, I would say you don't want to post a draft myself. I would wait until something was a little more polished, but that's just my opinion on that. Jim, what do you think?
I mean, I agree with that, but I think also that different people have different assessments of how drafty their own work is. I mean, when I send something to a journal, I believe that it is camera ready, and I don't understand why anyone ever would disagree with that. And yet, and I assume that many colleagues are the same, judging from how they respond to referee reports. Personally, I put stuff on the archive around the time that I submit it to journals. I encourage my students to do the same. Some of them do, some of them don't. Some of them wait until a first round of review. Some of them post it right after it's accepted. I think all of those are fine. I think the thing to think about is what are the costs and benefits of having your work out there, right? So one benefit that I have found, I'll just give an example. I had a paper I put on the archive, the physics archive, and submitted it actually to a physics journal. And within 24 hours, I had an email from the person who had invented the theory I was criticizing, pointing out a devastating error. And it saved a lot of people a lot of time, right? I could just withdraw it from the journal. I could, right? And that, I won't say it was unmitigatedly great, but on the whole, I think that it was a valuable way for things to have gone. And I think similar things can happen with philosophy papers, right? I mean, I've gotten spectacular feedback from, in some cases, quite senior people in response to things I put on the archive, better than referee reports that I'll get, and faster than referee reports, that I just, incorporate that in the next draft and send it back to the journal when the time comes.
Okay, next I've got Angela.
Thanks. So far, I was reflecting on this really interesting conversation. I think we're getting a great perspective from you all and your vantage of sort of overseeing and seeing the insides of these important institutions in our field. But one of the takeaways I take it from yesterday also is that you all are powerfully shaping in a variety of ways what philosophy is and what it will become. So I want to press you a little bit on that, or invite you, that's a better way to put it, invite you to say something about how you see your particular institution that you're at the helm of at the moment shaping the field, or how you'd like it to shape the field, and particularly, because I think this is, these are values shared by many or maybe all of you, with an eye towards Janet Stemweddle's point this morning about like the below the surface glacier, right, of all the philosophy of science being done that doesn't typically find its way into standard publications, and then Carol Lee's point about the challenges and promise of interdisciplinary collaboration.
Wendy, I'm hoping that you'll take the lead on describing how we exercise the levers of power here.
I mean, honestly, my own view is that, and I'm not sure I'm going to speak to exactly what you have in mind, but I hope so, is that my view is to just keep an open mind, to really try to, you know, if the journal gets something that's unusual, we're not sure if it goes within the bounds of the field, call it in. Let's see, is it of interest, right? I think, yeah, so I guess that's really my initial answer, is to not have in mind rigid kinds of boundaries and not think that something comes in needs to be able to slot into a category. And that actually does a lot of good work for broadening things, in my opinion. I have to think a little more. Jim, or someone else?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's a question of journal or publication. I think your point is about assessment and research evaluation. And in that case, the responsibility is shared among all of us when we sit in hiring committees or promotion committees, on when we talk to a university president, and when we become university presidents and all that. So I think your point is about diversity of criteria of assessment of research and all that, which goes back to the point that in Europe we have now this COARA. But what's interesting is that there's a big gap between what research leaders or politicians say about the need for evolution of research assessment and what we do concretely when we sit in a hiring committee. We just rush to the publication part of the CV and count the publications in philosophy of science. Or I don't know you, but even if we know that we shouldn't do that, I mean, I guess. So the responsibility is shared as soon as you sit in a committee, a funding committee, a hiring committee, or whatever. You have this responsibility to say, oh, no, let's not rush to this part of the CV and consider other parts of the CV. So it's not the whole story, but we can't take the responsibility out of our hands to others.
Michela, do you want to speak to this?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question, and I was trying to think what kind of answer one can give, because obviously we've heard obviously Wendy from the point of view of the journal, and Stéphanie from the more institutional point of view. I think there is no doubt that there are those power structure in place and fields that historically have been regarded as not kind of mainstream within philosophy of science. I found it hard to find a place in main journals and so forth. To my mind, a way of mitigating that problem has been through things like precisely the proceedings of the biennial conference. I think the overall method and procedure that leads to the selection of a conference program is a different kind of ball game from the sort of weekly ball game that I would imagine, Wendy or Jim or myself when I was the editor of the journal had to do. And when you're just dealing with a pool of submissions, and you have a page budget that is very strict, right? Because ultimately the question that Carol was asking in a very forceful way this morning, why the standards are so stringent when the stakes are so low, and the answer is simply page budget. If we could get rid of the page budget and just have a fully online journal, we wouldn't have that problem anymore. So this is the Ken Water proposal, right, that Jim was referring to. So if we went just online and we didn't have any print version, then we wouldn't have necessarily a cap on number of articles that can be accepted. So journal editors are under enormous pressure because there's a page budget that gets agreed with the publisher, and that page budget ultimately is what determines the cost of the journal for the institutions they have to pay, CUP or UP or Chicago or whatever. So there is a bit of economics behind all that, which is kind of goes beyond the specific decisions that the editors take on a weekly basis. Going back to my point, the conference proceedings is a different kind of ballgame, and I think there is a lot more space and leeway there for diversity and for introducing new ideas, new trends, new topics, new roundtable, and we've seen that with the biennial meetings. There's a proliferation of meetings that happen often, even kind of side events at lunchtime, where I think it's a perfect opportunity for new ideas, new topics, new trends that maybe up until that point have not been mainstream to be presented, to be to be listened to, really, and to have a voice. But yeah, it's not really much of an answer. It's more like a reflection about different ways and different format in which this plurality of voices and approaches can find, a way of being listened to in our community.
So I think something else to think about is, so as a journal editor, it's certainly true that I have a lot of power in one sense, but the way in which that power actually gets exercised is maybe different from what people imagine. It's primarily at the level of nominating people as associate editors and as editorial board members, and occasionally at the level of selecting referees. The number of times that I, as editor-in-chief, have had to make a difficult judgment call is fewer than 10, I would say. I mean, the process does most of the work. Papers come in, I do an initial review. If they aren't clearly outside the bounds of what we would publish, they go to an associate editor who does another review. Sometimes there's some discussion, but usually they send it to reviewers. They make a decision about the reviewer. Sometimes I send it to reviewers myself, but they make a decision about reviewers. The referee reports come back. And then in almost every case, it's completely clear what to do. And if it's not clear what to do at that point, the associate editor weighs in, and in virtually every case, I follow their advice. And so sometimes there are edge cases, and some further conversation has to happen or some decision has to happen, but mostly it's crowdsourced. And so the way in which influence gets exercised has to do with how you assess relevant expertise for evaluating a paper. Which associate editor is the right one to look at this? Which reviewers are the right ones to look at this? And it's not always the case, but very often you can anticipate what a reviewer is going to say. You can be surprised, but you can anticipate what a reviewer is going to say. And I often find myself thinking, well, I could send it to this person and they'll reject it, or I could send it to this person and they'll accept it, or I could send it to this person, I don't know what they'll do. And so I'm going to send it to the person who I don't know what they're going to do because that's going to be the most information. Or I do one of the other ones because I have my own sense of what's going to happen. But it's not exercising judgment at the level of me just giving thumbs up or thumbs down or overturning other people's decisions. I mean, that just never happens. Pache, one case recently. Sorry, Alan.
So we are unfortunately out of time. I know I've got multiple people in the queue, but also since basically they just got asked a really hard question, I think it's time to thank them and give them a break.